Welcome to Core and Bath Conversations, a podcast series dedicated to adoption, fostering and kinship care. We ask children's social care professionals and experts by experience to join us to share with us and you, our listeners, their experiences, reflections and knowledge. I hope you enjoy.
Hello, I'm Horne, Core and Bath's Kinship Consultant. This podcast is being recorded as part of Kinship Care Week in 2024. The focus of Kinship Care Week this year is This is Kinship Care, with an emphasis on raising awareness. We want to deepen the public's understanding of what kinship care is, as well as hopefully reach some of the many new MPs that are in post who will undoubtedly have kinship carers in their constituencies. For more information about Kinship Care Week, visit coreandbath.org.uk and look on our kinship care pages. Our focus today in this podcast is to consider what kinship carers tell us about their experience of being assessed by social workers, and to think about what this then means for social work practice, including how we consulted with kinship carers for the design and development of Form K, which is Core and Bath's new kinship assessment form due to be published in January. I'm delighted to be joined today by my job share partner, Claire. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, yes, I'm Clare Seth, and I am also the other half of the kinship consultant at Core and Bath, and I also work as a freelance social worker, primarily undertaking kinship assessments and kinship and support for kinship families.
Thanks, Claire. So Claire and I have worked together on the development project for Form K. And as part of the project, we held 2 focus groups with kinship carers, one online and one in person. And we also had 2 kinship carers as part of our working party that ran as part of the project for a number of months. So Claire, can you tell us about some of the key feedback we received from kinship carers in their focus groups and in the working party?
It was quite shocking, really, to hear people's experiences. So they started off by saying that there'd been a real lack of information, or they felt there was a real lack of information at the start of the assessment process. So feeling that they weren't fully informed in helping them make decisions. So when we think about whether kinship carers might become kinship foster carers or become special guardians, they didn't feel that they had that kind of information at the start of the process. And then they talked about some of the sort of feelings that they experienced. So felt that they were not always treated with respect, that there was a lack of basic courtesy. So one of the special guardians gave an example of not being asked when it was convenient to come and see her. And that sort of didn't really set the relationship off on a good footing. Questions that they were asked were maybe more appropriate, they felt, for mainstream foster carers rather than kinship carers. So thinking about the needs of lots of children rather than the specific child that they were hoping to care for. They also said that they felt misjudged and judged, that they felt misunderstood. They found that they were feeling angry. They felt that they were treated with disdain. They felt that they felt really cross towards the social workers. And I guess it's important to say that these were kinship carers who felt they'd had a negative experience of the assessment process. It's obviously not the experience of all kinship carers, but it's common themes that we do hear very regularly from kinship carers, that the whole process is very intrusive and that future needs are not properly considered. So whilst there's an assessment in the here and now, it's not really, their experience was that the future wasn't really thought about, either their future or the children's future. I guess another sort of striking point was that they felt the purpose of the assessment wasn't clear, and the sort of not really understanding why they were being asked specific questions. So, what we know is that social workers need to gather information to form an assessment and to complete their analysis. But for kinship carers, they didn't really understand why they were being asked questions about their childhood or about previous relationships. It just didn't make sense to them. So I think quite a confusing and fairly negative picture.
That's certainly the sort of the picture that's being painted, isn't it? Of quite a sort of bewildering experience, quite intrusive, and therefore I imagine quite difficult for those kinship carers that have kind of shared that feedback. And it is difficult to hear, isn't it, as a social worker, to hear that that's the experience of people that social workers have worked with. And I'm sure other social workers listening would be quite disappointed to hear some of that. Was there any more kind of positive messages shared, or anything that kinship carers did value about the assessment process?
Yes, happily there was. So we did get a balanced picture. But I think what the kinship carers really wanted us to hear was that those negatives as well, to sort of inform our assessment development work. But what they did say was that what was really important was having a relationship with a social worker, and having an ongoing relationship was really important, and having the time to build up as much as possible a trusting relationship. We know that many prospective kinship carers might have had previous involvement with social services, so start from that point of not having necessarily confidence or trust in what might be the process that might be happen, and obviously that leads to a lot of anxiety. So having the chance to form an ongoing relationship with a social worker was really key. And they talked about, the changes that the child might have had in terms of social worker, but that if they had had a consistent social worker, that made a real difference. They talked about the importance of cultural understanding and cultural humility, and social workers asking questions in a curious but respectful way, so that they could understand the family's culture, and highlighted the importance of not making assumptions about a family's history and about a family's culture. They also talked about the importance of good communication within the professional network and with the kinship carer, so that they're really included in sharing of information and communication, and that then felt that the whole assessment process was smoother, really, rather than being done to on a sideline, actually involved in discussions. And interestingly, they talked about the importance of being able to read the assessment report before it was either sent to the fostering panel or to court. It's a report that's written about them. It's really important, even if they're not able to change the social worker's recommendation, it's really important that kinship carers are able to check it for factual accuracy, and to check what information is being shared about them, particularly if it is in the court arena, because we know that can be very difficult for people if information that they have talked about, very personal and private information during the assessment process, is then shared with parties that maybe they would choose rather not to have that information shared with, and then to have it potentially presented in a more sensitive way. But if you don't have the chance to read the report beforehand, then you can't make those requests. They also talked about appreciating frankness and transparency from the social workers. So even if there were difficult conversations and vulnerabilities and risks were maybe being discussed, that actually it's much better to be honest about those rather than skirting around it. And just letting people know where they stand, really, I think was what came across. And they liked the opportunity to think about contingency planning. So again, quite often assessments, as we know, take place in a point of real crisis, and it's very much thinking about children's immediate well-being and safety. But actually what's really important for kinship families is to think about what if in the future, and to have those discussions as part of the assessment process, so that wider family and friends can be included in that from an early stage, rather than reaching another point of crisis further down the line. And some kinship carers said that actually, surprisingly, they found the assessment process could be quite cathartic and almost therapeutic, with a little t, if it's done well. And again, coming back to that opportunity to really build a strong relationship with a social worker, and somebody that they feel that they can have confidence in. And another really key one, I suppose, just to finish on, is not feeling prejudged. So we hear quite often that kinship carers feel very anxious because they might have had social services involvement with their children when they were younger, and that can maybe colour the views and the judgment of people that are then working with them in the future. So it's just important really just to hear people and to hear where they are in their lives and to give them the chance to talk about what's changed for them.
Thank you. I mean, like you say, that does present then more of a balanced picture, doesn't it, of some positives and I think some key kind of sort of messages around sort of social work practice, you know, around relationship-based practice and kind of cultural humility, which are not, of course, unique to kinship care. But thinking, therefore, about kind of kinship carers, sort of based on that feedback, therefore, how did that sort of inform, therefore, some of the key principles that sort of underpin the Form K assessment form?
So when we'd obviously had the chance to take that feedback from kinship carers and to talk to social work practitioners and to researchers, it's been an involved process in making sure that we take into account as many views as possible. And I think, you know, the things that really struck us were the need to have an assessment form that is really focusing on strengths. So a strengths-based assessment form rather than a deficit model. Now, that's not to say that we don't shy away from talking about vulnerabilities and risk, but what the emphasis is really on is having that strengths-based with really clear, robust analysis and an integral support plan, so that where we know that there might be vulnerabilities, we can be really clear about what support is going to be offered to the kinship family to mitigate against those risks, rather than, certainly what we're clear about is that people shouldn't shy away from being clear about what the vulnerabilities are, because we know that fostering panels and courts can get a little bit more nervous when they feel that maybe there isn't full information available to them. But actually, if we can be clear about what the support needs are, that's reassuring. It also sets it out very clearly for kinship carers, who again did talk to us about, you know, a lack of support planning and not knowing what was going to be available to them in the future. So if that is clearly set out in the assessment and they know where to go in the future and who to come back to, that can feel much more reassuring, I think, for families in the future. So those are the kind of the key principles, are that it's relationship based, as you know, as we've highlighted the need for that relationship with a social worker, that it's strengths based with clear, robust analysis and a very clear integral support plan.
And hopefully it will have the kind of impact, the positive impact that we want it to have on kinship carers, because obviously when we were sort of working our way through the project, one of our sort of intended aims was that it would improve the assessment experience of kinship carers, given, you know, the feedback that we'd received and the sort of what we know that kinship carers have been saying for many years really about the assessment process. And I know in your role as a freelance social worker, you've been using the Form K, haven't you, as part of the wider pilot project? Yeah. As part of the wider pilot project, how will Horne be seeking the views of those kinship carers who are now being assessed using Form K?
So we have designed 2 feedback forms. So the Form K is being piloted in 10 local authorities across the country, and we understand that there are at least 10 assessments being undertaken in each local authority. So it's getting quite wide reach, which is really good. And we're getting some really, really helpful feedback that will definitely inform the final design of the form. So part of that is we have created 2 feedback forms. So one for professionals who are involved in either undertaking the Form K assessment or reading the Form K. But more importantly, a form for kinship carers to complete as part of their experience and to talk about their experience of Form K. Now, it's quite challenging and it took us quite a lot of tweaking and thinking about to be able to ask about the experience of being, or to separate out the experience of being assessed as opposed to what it's like reading Form K. And I think that was quite hard, and I'm not sure that we'll ever get the 2 elements distinct from one another, because obviously what we hope is that Form K, whilst it a form and a template will always just be a form and a template, and it's how it's used and the skills of the social worker and the relationship that you build with the kinship carer that are going to be key. But it's hopefully going to give us some feedback about, so far, certainly from the families that I've worked with, they've said that they kind of understand the questions, why the questions are being asked and what the purpose of it is. One person has commented, so the form is quite long when it's completed in all its parts at the moment, and that's something that we're going to be tweaking. But the feedback that I've had was, well, it's good that it's long because it shows that you've taken the time to get to know us as a family and individually. So I think that would be great, if we can hear that feedback from people, but we also want to hear feedback where maybe it doesn't feel an improvement. And again, that's really difficult for us because obviously we can't ask kinship carers who've been assessed using a different format, but we're hoping that we will get some useful feedback from them. And because we're not publishing until next year, we've got time to incorporate changes into the form if that's the feedback that we receive. And another thing that we're doing, as well as asking those who've experienced the assessment with Form K, we're also meeting with a further focus group of kinship carers in the middle of next month to share the findings with them. They'll have a chance to look at the form and to look at it themselves, and then to give us further feedback, which will then further shape the final form.
I know from when we were thinking about the questions, what we were trying to capture was that sort of question in the feedback for the kinship carers who've been assessed using Form K is, does the form sort of capture you as a family? Does it capture what's important to you as a family in terms of how your family functions, but also in terms of your sort of family identity, be that kind of your ethnic identity or culture, but does it essentially capture you and what's important to you? Because I think that needs to come across, doesn't it, in a kinship assessment? It needs
Absolutely. To feel that people are properly represented, I guess, and can see themselves in what they read. Because that's, so it really is a true reflection. And I think feedback from another family that I've had is that they appreciate, the way that the questions were phrased in the form. They appreciated the fact that the vulnerabilities were talked about, but that the support was there too. So it wasn't seen as there are vulnerabilities, therefore we're not able to make a recommendation. They appreciated the fact that there was a balanced view. And I think that can be challenging for people because, the assessment process is anxiety provoking enough, and we know it's intrusive. And to have any vulnerabilities discussed can be quite a confronting thing. But I think if it, what their experience was, the fact that it was balanced with a support plan and the fact that they knew there was going to be ongoing support available for them, actually made them, be able to say, no, that's us. That is us. You've got it. You've got the strengths and you've got the vulnerabilities. And that's an honest picture of who we are. And I think that was really important, like you say, that kinship carers feel that they are properly reflected in the report.
And so important that kinship carers can then feel confident about the support that's going to follow. And even if a social worker works in a local authority where the kinship support offer is still kind of being developed and might not be kind of as sort of wide reaching or robust as perhaps social workers want it to be, we do know from the kinship strategy and from the sort of government reform agenda that there is more support becoming available to kinship carers. And so the support plan can very specifically signpost people to where some of those other universal support offers are, as well as other universal support offers perhaps local in your area, so that, if you are a kinship carer and it's a few years down the line and you haven't had a conversation with a social worker for a couple of years, but at least if you go back to that original support plan, there will be places then that that you can turn to for support at that point.
Yeah.
So we're hoping it will have, a positive influence, as we said, on the experience of kinship carers being assessed. But I guess as you were saying, in terms of the challenges of trying to isolate a carer's assessment of being assessed from the carer's assessment of reading Form K, we know that obviously a good form, and hopefully Form K will be a good form, is only one lever to kind of influence change and to influence assessment practice. What would you say perhaps are some of, a couple of other levers that perhaps could influence change around assessment practice?
Well, I think what we're hearing in terms of feedback from the pilot, which is really interesting, is we're starting to get feedback from the courts, and that if there is a negative recommendation, that the courts are still understandably requiring a support plan. And we know for kinship carers who've received a negative recommendation that can be really confusing because it might imply that support could be available. What we're hoping over time is that actually, because Form K asks for support needs to be identified throughout, what we're hoping in time is that actually the assessment in itself will be sufficient to reassure the court that absolutely everything has been considered in terms of what support could be offered, but that it's still a negative recommendation, so that kinship carers maybe feel less confused about what the outcome is. But we know that this is very early stages of the form being introduced, and that will take time for that to kind of filter through the courts throughout England. We're also hoping that because it is strengths-based and that really highlights the need for relationship-based social work, that will slowly start to have an impact on court timescales, because we absolutely know that social workers are under huge pressure to complete kinship assessments in really short timescales. We're still hearing sometimes 4 to 6 weeks, which at a point of crisis in a family's life and trying to build a relationship and to complete a robust assessment, those things just aren't compatible with short timescales. So we're hoping again over time that might filter through. And I guess another lever will be from fostering panels and an understanding. So hopefully a reduction in terms of fostering panel members' anxiety around kinship arrangements and approving carers as kinship foster carers, and a real understanding of the uniqueness of kinship carers and the differences between that and mainstream foster carers. And again, appreciating that with the integral support plan, that the support will be there for kinship foster carers, and that it can be creative. It doesn't have to be the same as it is for mainstream foster carers. So I think all of those things, and we are seeking feedback from the courts and CAFCAS and from fostering panel members. So it will be really interesting to hear over the next month or so what the feedback is, and again, how that can shape the final form.
Thank you. That's been a really, interesting sort of overview of how kinship carers' experiences have informed the sort of development of Form K, and hopefully will continue to inform the sort of final developments and final tweaks to the form, as you said, because we'll have one more final meeting with a group of kinship carers, as well as obviously hopefully hearing from some kinship carers who've been assessed over the last few months through the pilot project and their experience of being assessed using Form K. So thank you very much, Claire. And for those listening, obviously the Form K, as we've said, it is in draft form at the moment, and it's being piloted in 10 local authorities at the moment. We're hoping it will be published in January, so keep an eye on the website where there will be up-to-date information being published around sort of training being made available and a book being published alongside it, and then the form and the guidance being available through our licence scheme. And do come to our Kinship Practice Forum, which Claire and I run every few months. The information is available on our website, and we do quite often, on a regular basis, we provide updates about the developments of the Form K and the publication and the pilot. So keep an eye on the website where there's always more information. And thanks again, Claire.
Thank you. Good to have a chat.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Corranbath Conversations. If you'd like to know more or listen to earlier episodes, visit corranbath.org.uk.